Let's finish this. We all know how this ends. Harold Whitfield's final wishes are unlike anything I have ever read.
Peter, something doesn't feel right.
The Marlow Hill estate, the vacation homes, Whitfield Industries, every investment, every asset is hereby left to Clara Bennett.
What? That's impossible!
No, there has to be some mistake. I don't understand.
One day, I'll build something so big no one in this family will ever worry about money again.
Money comes and goes, son. Character stays.
Then I'll have both.
There's still one clause in the loan agreement, but no one's noticed it. Let's keep it that way.
Please make sure Mr. Whitfield receives this.
Clara,
Yes, sir?
you don't have to stay up this late. Do you remember delivering a note to my factory many years ago?
Honestly, I'd almost forgotten.
I never did.
Promise me something. Anything. When I'm gone, don't let Harold be alone. I promise.
Mr. Whitfield, the tests confirm it. You may have 2 years, perhaps less.
You won't face this alone.
She had scrubbed his floors for 30 years, and now she was sitting in a room full of people who hated her, about to become richer than all of them combined. Nobody in that room could look at her. Not his son, not his daughter, not even the lawyer, who kept clearing his throat like the words themselves were too heavy to say out loud. This is the story of Harold Whitfield, a man worth over $900 million, and the woman he chose over his own children. For 30 years they waited for this moment. They just never imagined her name would be in it. The lawyer, a thin man named Mr. Grayson, opened the envelope slowly, as if he already knew what it would do to the people sitting in front of him. Peter Whitfield sat with his arms crossed, jaw tight, already certain of what he was owed. His sister Susan sat beside him, twisting her wedding ring the way she always did when she was trying not to cry. And in the corner, almost as if she was trying to disappear into the wallpaper, sat Clara Bennett, the woman who had cleaned this house since before either of Harold's children could walk. Nobody had told her to be there. She had received a letter 2 weeks earlier, on plain paper, asking her to attend the reading of the will. She had almost thrown it away, assuming it was a formality, a small thank you gift, maybe a pension for her years of service. She had no idea that in a matter of minutes, her entire life was about to change in a way she never asked for and never saw coming. Mr. Grayson began to read. The house on Marlow Hill,
estate,
the vacation properties in Aspen and Naples, the shares in Whitfield Industries, the art collection worth tens of millions, all of it, every last cent, left not to his son, not to his daughter, but to Clara Bennett. The room went silent, in a way that silence rarely is. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Peter stood up so fast his chair scraped against the marble floor. Susan simply stared at Clara, her mouth slightly open, as if she was trying to remember how to speak. Clara did not move. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring at a spot on the carpet as if the floor itself might explain what was happening. She had washed that carpet 100 times. She had polished the very desk Mr. Grayson was reading from. And now, according to the paper in his hands, all of it belonged to her. To understand how a woman who mopped floors for a living ended up inheriting one of the largest fortunes in the state, you have to go back further than that room, further than that will, further than the day Harold Whitfield died. You have to go back to who these people were before any of this happened, because nothing about this story makes sense without understanding the people at the center of it. Harold Whitfield was not a man who gave things away easily. He was known, even by his own children, as someone who valued loyalty above almost everything else, and who rarely, if ever, changed his mind once it was made up. Peter Whitfield had spent the last decade waiting for his father to hand him the keys to the family business. He had built his entire identity around being the heir, the son who would carry the Whitfield name into the next generation. Susan had built a different kind of life, one built around the comfort of knowing that no matter what happened, her father's money would always be there as a safety net beneath her. Neither of them had ever imagined a version of their future that did not include that inheritance. And neither of them had ever really looked closely at the woman who had been in their father's house nearly every single day for 3 decades. Clara Bennett had been 26 years old when she first walked through the doors of the Whitfield estate. She was quiet, careful, and hardworking, the kind of woman who noticed details other people missed. She noticed which room Harold sat in when he was sad. She noticed that he ate breakfast alone every single morning, even after his wife passed away. She noticed the small things that made him human, long after his own children had stopped noticing anything about him at all. What none of them knew, not Peter, not Susan, not even Mr. Grayson sitting there with the will in his hands, was that the will everyone had just heard was not the first secret Harold Whitfield had kept from his family. There was a version of Harold that his children never got to see, a version that existed in quiet mornings and long evenings, in conversations that happened in kitchens and hallways rather than boardrooms. A version shaped not by wealth, but by the ordinary, unremarkable presence of a woman who never once asked him for anything. And it is exactly because she never asked for anything that what happened next made no sense to the people who thought they knew him best. It made sense to almost no one in that room. Almost no one, except for Clara. To really understand Harold Whitfield, you have to go back to a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, decades before anyone called him a billionaire, back when he was just a boy sleeping in a room above his father's hardware store. His family never had much. His father worked with his hands until they cracked and bled, and his mother stretched every dollar until it screamed. Harold used to say, later in life, that poverty teaches you 2 things, patience and hunger, and that most rich men only ever learn the second one. He carried that hunger with him for the rest of his life, long after the hardware store was a memory, and the name Whitfield meant something to bankers in 3 different countries. As a boy, Harold spent his afternoons sweeping the floor of that hardware store, counting nails into small paper bags, for customers who never tipped and rarely thanked him. He watched his father argue with suppliers over pennies, watched his mother turn old flour sacks into shirts for him and his younger brother, and decided, somewhere around the age of 12, that he would never again spend a single year of his life counting pennies the way his parents did. It was not greed that drove him, not at first. It was fear, the particular fear of a child who has watched adults he loves lie awake at night doing math that never quite comes out right. He left home at 18, with $60 folded into his shoe, a scholarship to a state university that barely covered tuition, and a stubbornness that would define the rest of his life. He worked nights loading trucks to pay for food, studied engineering because it seemed like the fastest path toward building something real, and graduated with almost nothing except a diploma and a plan. That plan became a small manufacturing operation that made parts for machines nobody else wanted to build. Founded when Harold was 23 years old, with borrowed money and equipment he barely knew how to operate. He worked 18-hour days, slept in his office more often than his apartment, and married young, a woman named Eleanor, who believed in him before anyone else did. Eleanor had grown up 2 counties over, the daughter of a school teacher, and she saw something in Harold that even his own family sometimes missed. Underneath all that ambition, a genuine tenderness he rarely let anyone witness. Together they had 2 children, Peter and Susan, and for a while, by every outward measure, they had exactly the life people spend their whole lives chasing. But ambition has a cost, and Harold paid it the way most driven men do, in missed dinners, missed recitals, missed ordinary Tuesday evenings that never come back around. There was a school play when Peter was 7, a small part as a tree in a forest scene, rehearsed for weeks, and Harold missed it entirely, stuck at the factory dealing with a shipment that had arrived damaged. Peter never brought it up again after that year, not because he forgot, but because he learned. At 7 years old, exactly how much space his father's business would always take up in their lives. Susan grew up learning to ask her mother for things instead of her father, because her father was rarely there long enough to ask. And somewhere in the space between all that ambition and all that absence, something quiet and permanent began to crack in the Whitfield family, long before anyone noticed it happening. Eleanor tried for years to bridge the gap, planning family trips Harold would cancel at the last minute, insisting on Sunday dinners he would often arrive late to, if he arrived at all. She never stopped loving him, but she learned, the way so many spouses of driven, ambitious people learn, to build a life that did not depend entirely on his presence to feel whole. When Harold was 38 years old, his company nearly collapsed. A shipment of faulty parts, a lawsuit from a client in Chicago, and a banking partner who pulled out of a loan agreement at the worst possible moment brought him within weeks of losing everything he had built. He remembered that period of his life more clearly than almost any other. The sleepless nights, the calls to bankers who no longer returned them, the sight of his own name on legal documents that used words like default and liquidation. Almost nobody outside that inner circle ever knew how close it came. Almost nobody except Eleanor, and one other person whose name never appeared in a single newspaper article about Harold Whitfield's rise to the top. That name was Clara Bennett, though at the time, she was not yet the woman who cleaned his house. She was, at the time, something else entirely, something the Whitfield children would not learn the truth of for another 30 years. Clara grew up 2 towns over from Harold, in a family with even less than his. Her father drove a delivery truck, and her mother took in sewing work to make ends meet. Clara was the kind of child who noticed everything and said very little, the kind of person who remembers a face for 20 years after meeting it only once. When she was in her early 20s, working as a bookkeeper for a small firm in the same town where Harold's first factory nearly went under, she crossed paths with him during the worst month of his professional life, a connection so brief that neither of them could have predicted what it would mean decades later. She had been sent, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, to deliver a set of financial records between 2 offices, a task far beneath her actual job, but common in a firm that small. While waiting in a hallway outside a meeting room, she overheard 2 bankers discussing, in low, careless voices, a technicality buried in a loan agreement that could allow Harold Whitfield's company one final avenue to avoid default, a clause almost nobody in the room besides those 2 men seemed to know existed. Clara did not know Harold Whitfield personally. She had passed him once in a parking lot, exchanged nothing more than a polite nod, but something in her, some instinct toward fairness that had defined her entire life, told her that information should not simply disappear into a private conversation between 2 men who had no intention of sharing it. She wrote it down on a scrap of paper, walked it across town on her lunch break, and handed it to a secretary at Harold's factory with instructions to make sure it reached him directly. She never confirmed whether it had. She never followed up. She simply went back to her desk and continued with her ordinary Thursday, unaware that she had just handed a drowning man a rope. At a moment when every bank in town had said no to Harold Whitfield, when his own board of directors had begun quietly discussing what would happen after the company folded, it was that single overlooked clause, the one Clara had passed along without ever expecting anything in return, that gave Harold's lawyers exactly the leverage they needed to renegotiate the loan and keep the company alive. He never learned who had sent that scrap of paper until years later, when a secretary long since retired happened to mention, in an unrelated conversation, the name of the young bookkeeper who had walked it across town on her lunch break. Harold never forgot it, though for years afterward their paths did not cross again, and life carried each of them down entirely different roads, one toward extraordinary wealth and one toward an ordinary, hard-working life that never asked to be extraordinary. 15 years passed before their paths crossed again, and by then, everything about both of their lives had changed. Harold Whitfield was no longer a struggling factory owner fighting off bankruptcy. He was the head of Whitfield Industries, a name printed on buildings, a fortune that made headlines, a man whose calendar was managed by 3 separate assistants. Clara Bennett, meanwhile, had lived a quieter, harder life. She had married in her late 20s, a man named Robert, who worked construction and drank more than he should have, and the marriage had ended after 8 difficult years, leaving Clara to raise their son, a boy named Daniel, largely on her own. Those years were not easy ones. Clara worked 2 jobs for a stretch, cleaning offices in the early mornings before Daniel woke for school, and taking in ironing work in the evenings after he went to bed. When Daniel was 9 years old, he fell seriously ill, a respiratory condition that required weeks in the hospital and left Clara with medical bills far larger than anything her modest income could absorb. She paid them the only way she knew how, slowly, faithfully, month after month for years, refusing to ask her ex-husband for help, refusing to ask anyone for help, carrying that debt quietly, the same way she carried almost everything else in her life. It was during that same stretch of hardship, after a long string of jobs that never quite paid enough, that an opening for domestic help appeared at a large estate on Marlow Hill. She had no idea, when she applied for that position, whose house it was. The listing simply said a private residence, references required, live-out position with flexible hours. She had no idea the name on the paperwork belonged to the same man whose business she had once quietly helped save. 15 years and an entire lifetime of hardship earlier. When Harold saw her name on the list of new household staff, he told no one what he remembered. He simply approved her hiring and said nothing more about it, not to Eleanor, not to his assistant, not even, at first, to Clara herself. Her first months in the house were quiet and unremarkable, the ordinary rhythm of a new employee learning where everything belonged, learning which rooms Harold preferred left untouched during the day, learning that Eleanor liked fresh flowers in the front hall every Monday morning without fail. It was 3 months before Harold ever mentioned their shared history directly. In a quiet moment in the kitchen one evening, when the rest of the house was asleep, he had come downstairs unable to sleep, found her finishing the last of the evening dishes, and simply said her name, followed by a question. He asked if she remembered a scrap of paper handed to a secretary 15 years earlier. Clara barely remembered the details herself. She had done so many small favors for so many people over the years that this one had faded into the general blur of an ordinary young life. But Harold did. Harold remembered everything. From that point forward, something shifted quietly in the Whitfield household, something so subtle that even Eleanor, who noticed almost everything, did not fully register it until years later. Harold began to trust Clara in a way he trusted almost no one else in his life, not because of any single dramatic moment, but because of 1,000 small ones, the kind of trust that builds itself slowly, brick by brick, over years of ordinary days. There was the winter Eleanor came down with pneumonia, and Clara stayed 3 nights past her scheduled hours without being asked, simply because someone needed to keep the fire going and keep watch over the medicine schedule. There was the summer Peter, home from college and furious about something his father had said, stormed out of the house, and it was Clara, folding laundry in the next room, who quietly left a plate of food outside his door that night, without a word, understanding that some kindnesses need no explanation. She was there for the small things nobody else noticed, the birthdays Harold almost forgot, until she gently reminded him a week in advance, the mornings Eleanor was too tired to get out of bed, and needed someone to simply sit with her until the fatigue passed. The long stretches when Peter and Susan were both away at school, and the house felt too large and too quiet for one man to sit inside alone. Harold began, without ever fully admitting it to himself, to look forward to the sound of her arriving each morning, the particular rhythm of her footsteps in the hallway, a small, ordinary comfort in a life otherwise defined by boardrooms and negotiations, and the constant, exhausting performance of being Harold Whitfield. Eleanor Whitfield passed away when Peter was 26 and Susan was 23, both already grown, both already building lives of their own, outside the walls of Marlow Hill. Her death came after a long illness, a slow decline that began with a diagnosis nobody wanted to say out loud, and stretched across nearly 2 years, each month taking a little more of her strength than the last. During that time, it was not Peter or Susan who spent the most hours by her bedside. Business kept Peter traveling, 3, sometimes 4 cities a month, negotiations he told himself could not wait, though looking back later in life he would wonder how many of them truly could not have. Susan, newly married, was building a household of her own 2 states away, pregnant with her first child during the final months of her mother's illness, torn between 2 lives that both seemed to need her completely. It was Clara, more often than either of Harold's children, who sat with Eleanor during her final months, who read to her when she could no longer hold a book steady in her own hands, who learned the exact rhythm of her medication schedule better than the visiting nurses did, who stayed long after her paid hours had ended simply because she did not want Eleanor to be alone in the particular hours of the night when illness feels heaviest. Eleanor, in turn, came to depend on Clara in ways she had never expected to depend on anyone outside her own family, confiding in her during long afternoons when pain medication loosened the careful boundaries most people keep between themselves and the people who work in their homes. In the final weeks of her life, Eleanor said something to Clara that Clara never repeated to another living soul, not to Harold, not to her own son Daniel, not to anyone, for almost 20 years. It was a request, quiet and simple, spoken in a hospital room with the lights turned low, machines humming softly in the background. Eleanor asked Clara to look after Harold once she was gone, not as an employee looks after an employer, but the way one person looks after another they have come to genuinely care for. She said she worried, more than she had ever told Harold himself, that once she was gone he would disappear entirely into his work, that the children, building their own lives, would drift further away, and that he would end up an old man alone in a large house with nobody who truly saw him. Clara made that promise without hesitation, and then, true to the kind of woman she had always been, she never once brought it up again, to anyone, for the rest of her life. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the years after Eleanor's passing, Harold Whitfield became a different man in ways his own children struggled to understand. Publicly, he remained exactly who he had always been: sharp, demanding, relentless in business, unwilling to slow down even as he entered his 60s. He closed 3 major acquisitions in the 2 years following Eleanor's death, expanding Whitfield Industries into markets it had never touched before, throwing himself into work with an intensity that some in the company quietly worried was less about ambition and more about avoidance. Privately, though, something had hollowed out inside him, a loneliness that no boardroom victory could fill. Peter visited when business allowed, which was rarely more than a handful of times a year, usually around the holidays, occasionally for a weekend that always seemed to end one day earlier than planned. He would arrive with good intentions and leave with the same vague guilt he always carried, the sense that he should be doing more, calling more, staying longer, without ever quite closing the gap between that feeling and actually acting on it. Susan called on holidays and sent cards on his birthday, always warm, always a little distant, the kind of distance that grows between people who love each other but have simply stopped knowing how to close the space between them. Her own children, Harold's grandchildren, knew him mostly through photographs and occasional video calls, a kind, distant figure rather than a constant presence in their lives. Clara, meanwhile, remained. She was there through every ordinary evening that nobody else witnessed, through every quiet dinner Harold ate alone at a table built for 8, through every long winter when the house on Marlow Hill felt more like a museum than a home. She never overstepped, never asked for more than her position required, never once hinted at the promise she had made to a dying woman nearly 2 decades earlier. There were evenings when Harold, restless and unable to sleep, would find her in the kitchen preparing for the next day, and the two of them would talk for an hour, sometimes 2, about nothing in particular: the weather, a book she was reading, a memory of Eleanor that had surfaced unexpectedly during the day. Those conversations, small and unremarkable as they seemed, became some of the only moments in Harold's later life when he felt like an ordinary man, rather than the sum of his net worth. But somewhere in those long, uneventful years, something had grown between Harold and Clara that neither Peter nor Susan ever saw, because neither Peter nor Susan was ever there long enough to see it. It was not romance, not in the way gossip columns would later try to suggest once the story broke. It was something quieter and in some ways rarer, the kind of deep, unglamorous loyalty that rarely gets written about because it does not announce itself with dramatic gestures. It simply exists, day after day, in the small choices people make to keep showing up for one another. By the time Harold turned 70, His health had begun to fail in ways he tried hard to hide from almost everyone. He kept working long past the point when his doctors advised him to slow down. He kept attending board meetings even as his hands began to shake, gripping the edge of the table when he stood to hide the tremor that had started in his left hand 2 years earlier. He told Peter and Susan very little about what was happening inside his body, partly out of pride, and partly, though he would never have admitted it, because he was not entirely sure either of them would come running if they knew. Clara was the one who noticed first. The missed meals, the fatigue he tried to explain away as simply getting older, the mornings he stayed in bed longer than usual and blamed it on a poor night's sleep. She began, quietly and without asking his permission, keeping a small notebook of her own, tracking which days he seemed most tired, which foods he could no longer eat without discomfort, which mornings he needed more time than usual to steady himself before standing. When she finally sat him down one evening and showed him 3 months of careful notes, laid out in her own handwriting on the kitchen table, Harold could no longer pretend the changes in his body were simply the ordinary wear of age. She was the one who finally convinced him to see a specialist, a decision that would change the final chapter of his life, and, in ways nobody could have predicted, change the futures of everyone connected to him. The diagnosis came on a gray afternoon in late autumn, delivered by a doctor who chose his words carefully and still could not soften what they meant. Harold Whitfield had perhaps 2 years left, maybe less, maybe slightly more if treatment went well, though nothing about his condition offered much room for optimism. Clara sat beside him in that small, sterile office, close enough that when his hand trembled on the arm of the chair, she reached over and covered it with her own, a gesture so natural neither of them thought to question it in the moment. He told Peter and Susan over the phone, in a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes, the kind of conversation a man has when he has spent his whole life keeping people at arm's length and does not know how to stop doing it even now. He gave Peter the medical facts the way he might summarize a quarterly report, efficient, unemotional, already moving toward logistics before his son had time to fully absorb what he had just heard. With Susan, his voice softened slightly, though he still could not quite bring himself to say the word frightened, even though it was, by every account from those closest to him, exactly what he felt. Both of them said they would visit soon. Neither of them fully understood how little time soon actually meant. Clara was the one sitting beside him in the room when the doctor first said the words out loud. She did not cry, not in front of him, though she cried later that night. Alone, in her small apartment across town, grieving in advance for a man who had quietly become one of the few constants in her adult life. She called her son Daniel that night, now grown with a family of his own, and told him only that an old friend was very sick, unable, even then, to fully explain the strange, complicated shape of what Harold had become to her over 3 decades. From that day forward, something in Harold seemed to settle, the way people sometimes settle once uncertainty becomes certainty. Once the fight against an unknown outcome becomes instead the quiet work of preparing for a known one. Over the following months, Harold began spending long hours in his study with Mr. Grayson, his attorney of nearly 20 years, working through the details of an estate that had taken a lifetime to build. These meetings often ran late into the evening, Mr. Grayson arriving with thick folders of documents, the two men speaking in low voices behind a closed door, while Clara moved quietly through the rest of the house, never once asking what was discussed. Peter assumed these meetings were routine, the ordinary business of a wealthy man putting his affairs in order before the inevitable. He had no reason to think otherwise, no reason to imagine that behind that closed door, his father was making decisions that would upend everything he believed about his own future. Susan, further away and further distracted by a life of her own, thought about her father's illness in the abstract, the way people sometimes do when grief has not yet fully arrived, present in the mind but not yet felt in the body. She planned to visit more, told herself she would call more often, made promises to herself that the demands of her own household kept quietly pushing back, week after week, month after month, the way good intentions so often get pushed back by the ordinary business of living. What Peter and Susan did not know, what almost nobody knew, was that Harold had begun asking Mr. Grayson questions that had nothing to do with his children at all. He asked about the legal process of changing a will. He asked how such a decision could be protected against being challenged after his death. He asked, in a quiet voice one evening near the end of that autumn, sitting across from Grayson with a glass of untouched water on the desk between them, how a man might go about making sure that someone who had given everything and asked for nothing might finally receive something in return, without that gift being torn apart by people who had never understood what that person had truly given him. Mr. Grayson, bound by decades of professional discretion, said nothing to anyone outside that room, not even when Harold's decision became clear to him, not even when he understood exactly whose name would appear on the final documents. He had known Harold long enough to recognize when a decision had already been made, and he understood, better than almost anyone else in Harold's life, that this particular decision had not come from confusion or impulse, but from years of quiet observation that Harold had simply never spoken about out loud. He simply did his job, carefully, meticulously, building a will designed to withstand exactly the kind of challenge he suspected it would eventually face, requesting an independent medical evaluation, confirming Harold's full mental competency, a step Harold agreed to without hesitation, almost as if he had been expecting the challenge long before it ever came. Harold's final months were quiet, in a way his life had rarely been. He stopped attending board meetings almost entirely, handing day-to-day operations over to a trusted vice president, while remaining chairman in title only. He spent his mornings on the back terrace of the house on Marlow Hill, watching the light move across the lawn, a view he had owned for decades but had rarely taken the time to actually see. He began keeping a small stack of books by his chair, novels he had always meant to read and never found the time for, working through them slowly in the quiet hours when his energy allowed. Clara continued coming to the house every day, though by then her role had shifted from housekeeper to something closer to companion, though neither of them ever used that word out loud. She read to him in the afternoons when his eyes grew too tired for the page, her voice carrying him through chapters of books he would never have chosen for himself, but came to look forward to regardless. She sat with him during the long, difficult nights, when the pain grew worse and sleep would not come easily, learning which position eased his discomfort, which quiet conversation could distract him from it entirely. She never once asked him what was in his will. She never once imagined that she needed to. Peter visited twice during those final months, each trip shorter than the last, each conversation circling business matters more than personal ones, old habits neither of them knew how to break even with so little time left. During the second visit, sitting across from his father in the study, Peter had started to ask something more personal, had opened his mouth to say something closer to what he actually felt, and then, out of habit more than intention, had pivoted instead to a question about a pending acquisition, watching something flicker briefly across his father's face before it disappeared behind the familiar, practiced calm Harold wore in every business conversation. Susan visited once, staying for 4 days that felt, to Harold, both too short and somehow exactly what he had come to expect. During that visit, she found herself, more than once, sitting in the kitchen with Clara long after Harold had gone to bed, the two women talking in a way Susan had never expected, about Eleanor, about the strange, quiet rhythms of a house that had once been full and was now mostly empty. She left Marlow Hill without fully understanding what she had witnessed during those long kitchen conversations, though something about them stayed with her in the months that followed, a feeling she could not yet name. Harold never blamed his children out loud for the distance between them. He had, after all, spent much of his own life creating that distance in the first place, and some quiet part of him understood that the debts of an absent father are rarely repaid simply because time is running out. In his private moments, though, in the notebook he had begun keeping in his final months, he wrote about the particular grief of watching your children love you from a careful distance, never quite close enough to see how much you had come to need them. Harold Whitfield died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, quietly, in his own bed, with Clara sitting beside him, holding his hand the way she had held Eleanor's hand years earlier in a hospital room neither of his children had been present for. His final words, spoken so quietly Clara had to lean close to hear them, were not about business, not about the will, not about anything Peter or Susan would ever learn. He simply said her name, followed by a single sentence of gratitude, and then, within the hour, he was gone. Peter and Susan arrived within the week, grieving in the particular, complicated way people grieve a parent they loved but never fully knew. The funeral was large, attended by business partners, community leaders, and distant relatives who had not spoken to Harold in years, but understood, correctly, that his passing was the kind of event that required an appearance. Reporters from the local business journal stood respectfully near the back, already drafting the obituary that would run the following morning, praising Harold's contributions to the region's economy without a single mention of the woman who had spent his final months by his side. Clara stood near the back of the church, dressed simply, saying nothing to anyone, watching a family mourn a man she had also, in her own quiet way, loved. Peter noticed her there, gave her a polite, distracted nod across the crowded room, the kind of gesture you give an employee whose name you technically know, but whose life you have never once wondered about. He had no idea, standing there in his dark suit, shaking hands with men whose names he would forget by the following week, that the woman standing quietly near the back doors was about to become the single most significant person in the next chapter of his life. 2 weeks later came the will reading, the room, the envelope, the silence that fell over Marlow Hill like a weight nobody in that room was prepared to carry. And now, knowing everything you know, the promise made to a dying woman, the debt remembered across 15 years, the quiet decades of presence that neither Peter nor Susan ever fully witnessed. Perhaps the shock in that room makes a different kind of sense. But shock, as the Whitfield family was about to learn, does not go away simply because a reason exists. It only sharpens into something else entirely, something closer to anger, something that would soon pull all three of them into a battle that none of them, including Clara, ever wanted to fight. In the days following the will reading, Peter Whitfield did not sleep. He replayed every conversation he had ever had with his father, searching for a sign he must have missed, a warning he had failed to see coming. He sat up late into the night going through old emails, old calendar entries, anything that might explain a decision that felt, to him, completely impossible to reconcile with the father he thought he knew. He could not accept that a man who had built an empire meant to be passed down through generations of Whitfields had instead handed it to a woman who, as far as Peter was concerned, had simply been paid to clean his house. Susan, meanwhile, moved through a quieter kind of devastation, less anger than disbelief, the particular grief of discovering that a parent's love, or at least a parent's trust, had apparently been measured differently than she assumed. She found herself thinking more than once about those kitchen conversations during her final visit, wondering what she had missed, what Clara had known even then that she herself had not been told. She did not call her brother for nearly 2 weeks after the reading, needing time alone with her own confusion before she could face his anger, certain it would be louder and more immediate than her own. Within a month, Peter had hired a legal team of his own, separate from Mr. Grayson, built specifically to challenge the will on the grounds of what lawyers call undue influence, the legal theory that a vulnerable, dying man may have been manipulated by someone close to him into signing away what rightfully belonged to his children. It was a serious accusation, one that would require dragging Clara's entire life, her finances, her relationships, her every interaction with Harold over 3 decades, into the harsh light of a courtroom and, soon after, into the harsher light of public attention. Susan, uncertain but unwilling to stand entirely apart from her brother, agreed to join the legal challenge as a co-petitioner, though privately she asked her lawyer, more than once, whether there was a way to understand the situation before simply fighting it. News of the dispute leaked within weeks, first through legal filings that were technically public record, then through local reporters who recognized a story too compelling to ignore, and finally through national outlets that turned Clara Bennett's quiet, private life into a headline read by millions of strangers who had never met her, never worked beside her, and knew nothing about the 15 years of trust that had led to that single moment in Harold Whitfield's kitchen so many years before. Overnight, she became a symbol to people who had never met her, praised by some as proof that decency is still rewarded, condemned by others as proof that even the wealthiest families are not immune to manipulation. Cameras began appearing outside her small apartment building, reporters knocking on the doors of neighbors who barely knew her, asking questions she had no way of answering herself. Her son Daniel, now a father of two, found his own workplace suddenly aware of the family connection. Co-workers asking careful, curious questions he did not know how to answer. Clara stopped opening her front curtains during the day. She stopped taking her usual evening walks around the block. The small, ordinary routines of her life, suddenly no longer safe from strangers, with cameras and opinions about a story they had only read in headlines. Investigators hired by Peter's legal team dug into every corner of Clara's life, searching for anything that might explain, in a way that satisfied their theory, why an intelligent, careful man like Harold Whitfield would leave his entire fortune to his housekeeper. They interviewed her former neighbors, pulled records from her divorce decades earlier, examined every bank statement she had filed in the past 10 years. They found an old debt from years earlier, a modest one, tied to medical bills from her son's childhood illness. And for a brief, tense period, it appeared as though they had found their explanation, evidence, they argued, of financial desperation that made her an easy target for a lonely, dying man's misplaced generosity. Reporters ran with the story for nearly a week, publishing pieces with headlines that painted Clara as a woman with a motive, a struggling single mother who had found, whether by design or by circumstance, an extraordinarily convenient benefactor. Clara read none of these articles herself, though friends and neighbors could not always resist telling her what was being said about her online. Strangers debating her character in comment sections beneath photographs taken from a distance outside her apartment building. It was, by every account from those close to her during that period, the hardest month of her adult life, harder even than the months she had spent nursing Harold through his final decline. The story shifted, though, once deeper digging revealed the debt had been paid off in full more than a decade earlier, using nothing but Clara's own modest savings, slowly, faithfully, without a single cent of help from Harold Whitfield or anyone else. Bank records, subpoenaed as part of the legal proceedings, showed years of small, consistent payments. $40 one month, $60 the next. The unglamorous arithmetic of a woman paying down a debt entirely on her own, long before she ever had access to Harold Whitfield's fortune. The theory that had dominated headlines for a week quietly fell apart under its own weight, though as often happens, the correction received a fraction of the attention the original accusation had. Another lead briefly consumed the investigation. An old photograph found among Harold's private papers, showing a much younger Clara standing beside a much younger Harold outside a factory in Ohio. A photograph that seemed, to Peter's legal team, to suggest a relationship stretching back further and deeper than anyone had previously known. The photograph had actually been taken by a company photographer documenting factory staff during a period long before Clara worked for the Whitfield household, capturing a moment when she had simply been one of dozens of employees photographed for an internal newsletter, standing near Harold only by coincidence of where the photographer happened to be positioned that day. For a moment, it appeared to confirm every dark theory circulating in the press, until Mr. Grayson, breaking his long professional silence, stepped forward to explain what the photograph actually documented. The quiet, long-forgotten moment when a young bookkeeper's small act of honesty had once saved a struggling businessman from bankruptcy, 15 years before she ever set foot in his home as an employee. He released, with Clara's reluctant permission, the original personnel records confirming she had worked at an entirely separate company at the time the photograph was taken, present at the factory that day only because her firm handled a portion of its bookkeeping. That single piece of context did not end the legal battle, but it changed its shape entirely. What had begun as a story about manipulation slowly transformed, in the public eye, and eventually in the courtroom itself, into something closer to the truth, a story about a decades-long debt, quietly carried and quietly repaid. Susan, who had remained largely silent throughout the early months of the dispute, was the first among Harold's children to begin questioning whether the fight her brother had started was really the fight she wanted to be part of. It was during a deposition, nearly 8 months after Harold's death, that the fullest picture finally emerged, pieced together from Mr. Grayson's careful records, from Clara's own reluctant testimony, and from a series of letters Harold had written but never sent, discovered among his private papers after his passing. Clara sat across a long conference table from Peter's legal team, her hands folded in her lap the same way they had been folded in the room where the will was first read, answering each question in a quiet, steady voice that never once wavered, even as the questions grew sharper, more pointed, occasionally verging on accusations dressed up as inquiries. When one attorney asked her directly whether she had ever asked Harold for money, for gifts, for any form of special treatment during her 30 years in his household, Clara answered with a single word, no, and then, after a long pause, added that she had never expected anything beyond her regular wages, that the idea of the will had never once crossed her mind, not during Eleanor's illness, not during Harold's final months, not even on the morning she received the letter asking her to attend its reading. Peter, sitting silently beside his own attorneys throughout the deposition, watched her answer question after question with the same steady composure, and something in his certainty, present since the day of the will reading, began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. In those letters, addressed to no one in particular, discovered folded inside a leather notebook in Harold's study, Harold had written openly about Eleanor's final request, about the promise Clara had quietly kept for nearly 20 years without ever once mentioning it to him, about the loneliness of his final years and the singular presence that had made those years bearable. He had written in his own hand that the decision to leave his fortune to Clara Bennett was not made in confusion or vulnerability, but with more clarity than almost any decision he had made in his entire life. Reading those letters aloud in a quiet courtroom, Mr. Grayson's voice carried a weight that silenced even Peter's legal team. Harold had written that his children would inherit something else entirely, something he hoped mattered more in the long run than money ever could, the truth about who their mother had been in her final days, and the truth about the woman who had quietly loved their entire family long after the rest of the world had stopped paying attention. He had left instructions, separate from the will itself, for both Peter and Susan to receive personal letters of their own, letters neither of them had yet found the courage to open. Susan opened hers first, alone, late one night nearly a year after her father's death, sitting on the floor of her own kitchen with the envelope in her lap for nearly 20 minutes before she finally broke the seal. In it, Harold wrote about the guilt he carried for every missed recital, every empty chair, every ordinary evening he had traded for a business meeting that, in the end, meant nothing compared to the years he had lost with his children. He described a specific memory, a summer afternoon when Susan was 9 years old and had asked him to come watch her swim across the lake near their old vacation house, a request he had said yes to, and then, distracted by a phone call, forgotten entirely, watching from a window an hour later as she swam it alone. He wrote about Clara not as a replacement for the family he had built, but as someone who had simply refused to give up on him during the years his own children, through no cruelty of their own, but simply through the distance life creates, had drifted further and further away. He asked Susan, in the final lines of that letter, not for forgiveness, but for something he considered harder, understanding. And he asked her, if she found it in herself, to get to know Clara, not as a rival for her father's affection, but as someone who had loved this family, in her own quiet way, for longer than Susan had realized. Peter did not open his letter for several more months, carrying it instead in the inside pocket of his jacket like a weight he was not yet ready to set down. He took it out more than once, turned it over in his hands, and returned it to the drawer of his desk without breaking the seal, not entirely sure he wanted to know what it contained, not entirely sure he could survive whatever explanation his father had left behind. When he finally did read it, alone in his father's old study, the room still smelling faintly of the cedar and leather Harold had always kept close, he found not an explanation designed to justify the will, but something closer to an apology, the closest thing to one his father had ever offered him while alive. Harold wrote about the day Peter was born, about a fear so large it had nearly paralyzed him, the fear of becoming the kind of father his own had been, absent in a different way, but absent all the same. He wrote with a rare and uncomfortable honesty that he had become exactly the father he feared becoming, not through cruelty, but through the slow, ordinary accumulation of choices that always seemed to favor the business over the boy. He wrote that he understood exactly how much anger his decision would cause, and that he had made it anyway, not because he loved Clara more than his own children, but because he had run out of time to love his children the way they deserved, and had, in the final years of his life, found in Clara Bennett the kind of presence he wished he had been able to offer Peter and Susan all along. The legal case did not end in a dramatic courtroom victory for either side. Instead, nearly a year and a half after Harold's death, Peter withdrew his challenge entirely, quietly, without a press conference, without a public statement, in a decision that surprised almost everyone who had followed the case since it first made headlines. He called Mr. Grayson himself late one evening, his voice quieter than the attorney had ever heard it, and simply asked him to file the necessary paperwork. Those closest to the family understood it differently, not as a surrender, but as the slow, painful process of a son finally reading his father's words closely enough to understand them. What happened next surprised almost everyone, including, in some ways, Clara herself. Rather than simply accepting the full inheritance and stepping quietly into a life of extraordinary wealth, Clara did something few people in her position ever choose to do. She invited Peter and Susan to Marlow Hill, sat with them at the same long table where Harold had once eaten breakfast alone, and proposed an arrangement none of Harold's lawyers had drafted and no legal document required. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours, awkward at first, punctuated by long silences, until slowly, cautiously, something closer to honesty began to fill the space between them. She would honor her promise to Eleanor and the trust Harold had placed in her, but she had no interest in erasing his children from the story of his life, or from the future of the fortune he had built. Working with Mr. Grayson, Clara established a family foundation in Harold and Eleanor Whitfield's names, directing a significant portion of the estate toward causes that had quietly mattered to Harold throughout his life: scholarships for first-generation college students, support programs for families facing sudden medical debt, and revitalization projects in the small Ohio town where he had once counted nails into paper bags as a boy. She placed both Peter and Susan on its board, not as a gesture of guilt, but as an invitation. One final attempt to give the Whitfield family a reason to sit at the same table again, working towards something larger than the inheritance that had nearly torn them apart. The house on Marlow Hill, once the site of the coldest, most painful morning any of them had lived through, slowly became something else in the years that followed, a place where Peter, Susan, and Clara gathered several times a year, not quite a family in the traditional sense, but something that had grown, unexpectedly, out of grief, anger, and the slow, difficult work of understanding a man none of them had fully known while he was alive. Susan's children, Harold's grandchildren, came to know Clara over those years, not as a headline or a stranger, but as a woman who remembered their birthdays, who kept a drawer of small gifts for their visits, who told them stories about their grandfather that neither Peter nor Susan had ever heard themselves. Clara Bennett never moved into the main house herself. She kept her small apartment across town for the rest of her life, visiting Marlow Hill often, but never quite comfortable calling it home. The way people who remember exactly where they came from rarely lose that particular kind of humility. She used a portion of the fortune to care for her own son Daniel and his growing family, quietly, without publicity, paying off his mortgage without telling him, until the paperwork was already complete, setting aside funds for his children's education that he would not discover for years. She continued the same modest routines she had always kept: her Sunday mornings at church, her weekly calls with an old friend from the neighborhood where she grew up, the same ordinary rhythms she had lived every other year of her life, before a single will reading turned her into a name strangers recognized on the street. Looking back on everything that happened, it is easy to ask whether Harold Whitfield made the right decision, whether a man is entitled to leave his fortune to whoever he chooses, or whether some deeper obligation to blood and family should have outweighed 30 years of quiet, unspoken loyalty. There is no single answer that satisfies everyone who hears this story, and perhaps that is exactly the point. Harold spent the first half of his life building something extraordinary, and the second half of his life slowly learning what and who actually mattered enough to leave it to. Whether he was right to trust a woman who asked for nothing over children who, in their own ways, had simply grown distant from him, is a question every person who hears this story ends up asking themselves. Would you have made the same decision he did? Would you have understood it? If you were standing in Peter's shoes, reading a letter from a father who explained everything and apologized for nothing, would you have opened that letter at all? Or would it still be sitting, unopened, in a drawer somewhere, the way it nearly did for Peter, for months, before he finally found the courage to face what his father had left behind? Tell us in the comments what you would have done in Clara's position, and what you think Peter and Susan should have done in theirs. And if you want more true stories about family, money, and the secrets people carry for decades before the truth finally comes out, there are more of them waiting for you. Real families, real fortunes, and the quiet decisions that changed everything for the people who lived through them.